Just to give you a brief overview, so we have Ryan Tolley from Change Illinois, who will provide a condensed version of federal, state, and county redistricting, everything that goes into that, and then the principles and laws that guide a fair process of that. And Richard Brunk, the Rock Island County Board Chair, will provide a quick overview of what the county faces and what the county's done to date. The time that we have left then will be for questions asked by the audience. Without further ado then, I will pass the microphone baton on to Ryan Tolley. Thanks again for being here tonight.
Thank you, Lisa. Really great to be here with all of you tonight. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the redistricting process in Illinois, talk about some of the past issues in years past with gerrymandering and what folks can do to get involved and to get engaged in Illinois' redistricting process. Just a little bit about myself and the organization. I'm with Change Illinois. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We primarily work on ethics and efficiency in elections and governments. A large part of our organization's agenda historically and continues to be around how we redraw political maps in the state. Along with our partners at the League of Women Voters, we've really focused on redistricting reform over past years to put the power of redistricting in the hands of an independent commission to draw maps rather than the current process where lawmakers do that currently. So I'll go a little bit in depth in that later. I think just to kind of recap, we'll talk a little bit about the 2020 census and why that's important for redistricting, talk about gerrymandering, talk about how Illinois redistricts, talk about our Fair Maps Amendment and other solutions, and then talk about how you can get involved and make your voice matter in the redistricting process. So last year was a census year. Every 10 years, the Census Bureau launches a mass operation to try to count everyone in the United States. Illinois also, helped out with this effort. The state spent over $30 million of its own money to ensure that residents across the state would get counted. And we do this every 10 years to account for where populations are moving, where folks live now as compared to 10 years ago. But it's important for two reasons. One of those is census counts are how we allocate a lot of federal funding and where that goes. And then also the census numbers are typically the basis of what political maps look like. So, we need to ensure that everyone's vote counts equally here. And so when populations move, every 10 years, we redraw the maps to say, okay, where are those populations? And there's a little bit more to it than that. There's also assurances to ensure that minority representation is protected through the Federal Voting Rights Act. But really, for purposes of tonight's presentation, the census is really important to ensure that we get redistricting right and using those numbers. There's been a lot of debate this year because of the census delays over how we utilize census data that typically comes out around this time of the year, but now it's not going to be available till the fall due to the pandemic. And I'm happy to talk about that a little more if folks do have questions. But as I said, the census is a building block for resources, and it's the building block for how our legislative districts are made up. So to talk a little bit about how redistricting works in Illinois for congressional and state legislative maps is the year after the census, those maps need to be redrawn. And so there's a few factors that lawmakers are looking at when redrawing the maps. Making sure that communities of color have proper representation through the Federal Voting Rights Act. There's also the Illinois Voting Rights Act, which gives more opportunities for communities of color that may not be a majority of a district to be drawn together in a district to ensure a person of color is elected. And then in the Illinois Constitution, we have the requirements that Districts should be substantially equal in population. Districts should be compact, and they should be contiguous. And so those are kind of the legal requirements of what lawmakers are looking at for drawing maps. And these those apply to our state districts. And then for congressional districts, it's really making sure they're equal in population and that they're abiding by the Federal Voting Rights Act. So our Constitution lays out a process of how this works. Step one is legislators take an attempt to draw a map for the Senate and the House just must approve these by simple majority if they can get it done by May 31st. They still have until June 30th to pass a map. According to the Constitution, they would just need a supermajority in order to do that. And after they pass a map, it would be sent to the governor for approval. The governor could either sign that map into law, or the governor could veto it. And if they can't override the governor's veto, a split commission is named. So the legislative leaders get to select 8 members, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, that would be in charge of this process until September. The split commission has the opportunity to try to draw a map. If they fail to do that, then a random name is selected out of the hat. There's one member of the Republican Party and one of the Democratic Party put in the hat. So it's kind of random on which party would take control of this process if they can't come to an agreement. There's since the Constitution was adopted in 1970, this process has played out in 4 of the 5 redistricting cycles. So we are no stranger to this process in Illinois. It is the process that we have used predominantly through our state's redistricting since that's how the process was established in 1970. The only year that did not happen was in the last redistricting cycle in 2011. So what happens when redistricting goes wrong is a practice called gerrymandering. So as you can see from this graphic, we'll take an area, we'll say that 60% is blue, 40% is red, and there's 50 precincts. One way to draw this map, you could make every single district blue with 0 red, even though red is 40% of this population. There's a way to draw it where they would have 0 representatives on this 5-person elected body. Or you could draw the map where even though the red is less than the majority, you could have 3 red districts and 2 blue districts, giving red an advantage over blue, even though they're not the majority. So, when we're looking at map making and we look at these criteria of the Federal Voting Rights Act, the Illinois Voting Rights Act, and compact and contiguous and substantially equal in population, there's a lot left on where lines can go, even meeting those requirements. And so this will kind of get into the next part of the presentation, but that's why it's so important for communities to have input in this process, so that it's communities and it's your local areas driving where all these other lines are going to go in the redistricting process. So some things we kind of highlighted, that's what's wrong with how the current process has played out and why you should really care, is that in Illinois, for state districts and for congressional districts, elections really aren't that competitive. On the state level, about half of Illinois' districts in the last election did not have 2 choices in the general election. And then 80% of the elections weren't even really competitive. So the candidates won in a landslide. Self-preservation is another issue. If a legislator's top priority is self-preservation, then if they draw a district that's really about protecting their incumbency, rather than drawing it around the communities, that doesn't help the communities, because if they're solidified in their district, you don't get a healthy competition, back to the first point. And then in past years, we've really seen little public input or transparency around the process, how the process works. And I'll go a little bit deeper into the difference between public input and meaningful public input in this process. But it's something we've seen in past state redistricting cycles where, public hearings are held. And then, when it comes time to drawing the map, you're looking at the map, and you don't see where the public input's being incorporated, or even an explanation for why that input isn't being incorporated into the map. In 2011, too, one of the issues was that a map proposals was introduced and then votes were taken the next day. And that really didn't give the public the opportunity to say, look at the maps and say, understand how it's going to affect their communities, and then be able to weigh in before it was adopted into law. So, one of the things that I highlighted in the beginning is that Change Illinois has supported the concept of an independent commission. This is a practice that's being used in 4 states. This graphic's a little outdated. Virginia just adopted a commission process as well. Their state legislature no longer controls the process, but here in Illinois and in this redistricting cycle, it still is under the state legislature to draw a map rather than some kind of a commission. Other states too have a political appointed commission, or some have a commission that is politicians. That happens in Montana, Idaho, Pennsylvania, Ohio. And then there's other states that do advisory type commissions that send suggestions to the legislature to consider. And so when we talk about ending gerrymandering, this has been a concept that's really been widely supported in Illinois. We conducted a survey last year, and 75% of voters who participated in that survey said they wanted it into gerrymandering. And that brings us to really, in this redistricting cycle that's happening right now, hearings are being held right now for folks to have a say in that process. Is, we have to speak up now. If you're not out advocating for your community, it may be something where unintentionally your community gets split up and your voice gets diluted because you weren't there saying, this is what's important to my community, this is why we should be held together and stay in a single district. So Change Illinois, as I said, we long pushed for amendment to give the power map drawing to voters and through an independent commission. That would have been a constitutional change, which would have required three-fifths of the state legislature to approve it, and then it would have went to voters for adoption. Given that we're in March, redistricting is happening this year, and the question would still have to go to voters even if the General Assembly passed legislation. The idea of having an independent commission just isn't feasible for this redistricting cycle for state maps. So instead, it really comes down to folks making sure their input's heard about their communities. One of the things that we hear a lot of rhetoric around the redistricting process in Illinois so far, and we hear that it needs to be inclusive, it needs to prioritize the Federal Voting Rights Act, preserve communities, let community input guide the process, let residents be the ones guiding how this process works. But it really takes folks stepping up and continuing to push that in order to make it happen. So I'll talk a little bit about some ways that folks can get involved and get engaged. But really, as we've been watching the hearings proceed at a state level, some of the things that we've highlighted that would be changed through the legislation I have here, HB 3581 and SB 2554, would be ensuring that the input that's being collected right now actually has a meaningful effect on how districts are being drawn. So there was just a hearing last weekend in Rock Island that the House held. We're hopeful they'll have more, but we've really been pushing to ensure that the input that's going to be used is actually used in the maps, and that, for whatever reason, like if input isn't being used, that's being relayed to folks to say, these are what the interests are in the area, and this is how the map met these and couldn't meet these other interests. And also ensuring that the General Assembly is producing a compliance report with map proposals to say, this is how we met the standards in the Federal Voting Rights Act. This is how we incorporated your public feedback. And we've also been advocating for a 2-week period between map proposals being introduced and votes being taken to ensure that, you know, members of the public like you have the opportunity to look at these maps and say, where, you know, how does this affect my representation? How does this affect my community's representation? And if there are adverse effects, or if your community isn't properly represented through that, that you have the opportunity at a public forum to talk to lawmakers about it and say, this is going to disenfranchise my community. Splitting our community in 2 or 3 ways here is going to dilute our ability to advocate effectively, because we're not the majority in any of these districts, or a very small piece, and they may have just more of a, you know, a different community may have a stronger voting power in the district. So as I started kind of lay out, the bill really hits on a few key points. We need to know how the process is going to proceed throughout the year. Again, they have until June 30th to pass a map. And all we know so far is that they're going to hold hearings through April 17th. But lawmakers haven't made it clear what that process looks like from April 17th to June 30th. And so if we expect the public to engage in this process in a meaningful way, we need to know if there's going to be more hearings during that period, if we can expect to see a map proposal that the public will get to weigh in on. You know, we need to understand how they're navigating the Census Bureau delays, if a map's going to be produced before the Census Bureau has the opportunity to provide that. Also, you know, making sure that map proposals are released for public inspection. That may seem like a given that, you know, we get to see the map proposals, but that hasn't been the case in previous years. And also providing 2-week notice for future public hearings and publicizing them broadly. I for one get paid to do this, and you know, it's part of my day to ensure that I'm on top of things. But if you're working a full-time job, you have kids, having a very short 6-day public notice period, it makes it difficult, particularly that since most of the hearings are being held during the weekdays in the middle of the day, there hasn't been a ton of opportunities for folks to participate on the weekends or in the evenings when their schedules may be more flexible. And so we really need to ensure that if we want the public to engage, we're giving them that notice ahead of time. And we're also publicizing these events or these hearings heavily, not just relying on putting it on a website and expecting that people are going to go to that website each day and check in and see when hearings may be getting added. And as I said before, it's important to have that 2-week period between the introduction of map proposals and when votes are going to be taken, and have hearings during that time, again, so the public can really have input on that. And then that compliance report that really shows how this is how we incorporated public feedback. This is how the public guided our hands in creating a map. And so that brings us to what you can do to be involved in this process and make a difference. There are free tools available to you for mapping. Representable is one where we've done a lot of training on. This tool allows you to map out your community area. It's pretty easy to use. Of course, you know, our organization and others can be a resource to folks to help. If you're more interested in building districts at a state and congressional level, there's tools like District R, District Builder, Dave's Redistricting app, where you can use those to draw districts out. The good part I failed to mention about Representable, that the Representable tool can be used for local municipal redistricting, county, state, or federal. Some of the other apps are limited to just state and congressional districts, but Representable is a good tool because you can get as small as you want or as big as you want, depending on what your community looks like. And using these tools can help you become a better advocate to lawmakers for your community. I have been in multiple hearings where folks can talk about in the abstract of what their community is. But if you can put your community on a map and show that visual, it helps lawmakers too, because they're not trying to take a description and reinvent that and put that, you know, into map software. They can see exactly with the areas you're saying what make up your community. The other thing to do once, or even if you don't go and do maps, is testify at public hearings. The state's scheduled to hold public hearings through mid-April. There's a link in here, and I'll make sure that we can try to get this slideshow out to folks so you have the links, but testify to talk about your community. We have a running Google Doc that we update really frequently to ensure that, you know, if hearings get changed, that people have a reliable resource to go to and know when hearings are going to happen in their area. Also on that sheet is staff contact information. If you want to sign up and testify, we provide their email, so you can email them and let them know that, you know, if the hearing has virtual participation, that you would like the link and be able to do that. So it's a really good way, though, to ensure that, you know, particularly on record, that your community is being recognized and being recognized, and ensure that you have a voice in this process. And it also allows you, if you can talk about your community now, when map proposals come, you can use that to say, you know, when I talked about my community on this date, you know, how did you use this input into this proposal that is now out? The other thing you can do to ensure that your voice is heard is letters to the editor. I always tell people, you know, this is a powerful tool. I would also encourage people to talk to their local elected officials about if you have a map or you have concerns. Maybe it's saying this district doesn't exactly, you know, the way the districts are now disenfranchises us, or districts work now, keep them together. But if you find yourself having trouble meeting with your local elected officials, your state reps or your state senator, letters to editor are a great way to start a conversation in the community. Most letters to the editor should be around 200 words max. And if you have pictures of your maps or you have maps, you should submit them as well. Because again, I think, as we all know, visuals are a useful tool to start a discussion and to help people comprehend what you're trying to present as your community. So letters to the editor are a great way to increase public pressure to ensure that your voice is being heard outside of these hearings. So we aren't necessarily just limited to trying to find a hearing that's going on near you, or, you know, trying to get out of, you know, Tuesday workday to make a hearing at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. This is a great way to do that. And so, you know, I would encourage everyone really to get involved with this process. As I said earlier, you know, it could be one of those things where your community is just not considered and split up if you're not there advocating for them. You have to step up and be that voice of the community to ensure that you're being recognized, and that your community is going to get the representation it deserves. And as I said earlier, you know, I encourage people to, even if your community right now districts work for you and you like it, it's still important to express at public hearings, because the lines are getting shifted. The populations are going to shift, and right now no lines exist for 2022 and for the next decade. And so I wouldn't want folks to think, because the lines exist the way they are now, that means they have nothing to worry about for the next decade. Because again, it's one of those things, if you're not there, you could be split up because no one was there advocating for your community. So you could always follow us on social media to stay more informed. I would encourage everyone to take three action steps, and, you know, make it to the hearings for your local area. Contact your lawmakers, write letters to the editor, and then utilize some of the mapping softwares like Representable to draw your community area. I promise everyone, for these tools, you don't need to be an expert data analyst. You don't need to be an expert map drawer in order to engage with these resources. A lot of the folks that created these softwares wanted to be, you know, they were very at the forefront of their thought was, how do we make this as easy as possible for everyday people to use and be advocates for themselves. And of course, I can share my email in the chat, but yeah, I'm happy to be a resource to folks too, as you're trying to navigate this and learn how you can participate to ensure that you feel confident and you have the resources you need to be successful in advocating for your community. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. And I can turn it over to Richard to talk about the local county.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ryan, for providing that education out to the community. And Richard, thanks again for being here tonight. And we'd love to hear from you and what the county's done and what we're currently doing.
All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity. Good evening, everyone. Just to kind of recap where the county has been with the reapportionment and the board reduction, which will be included as part of that process this year. Just to recap, state statute as it relates to this process for our county. Illinois state statute actually for counties with a population of less than 3 million and a township form of government, the board must determine specific items through the reapportionment process. The first being the size of the county board that'll be elected, whether the board members will be elected at large or by county districts. If the board determines that the members will be elected by districts, it needs to determine the number of districts and how many members per district. It also determines whether the chair of the board will be elected at large or by the members of the board. And it also determines the structure and amount of compensation for the members. The timeline for this is normally to be wrapped up by July. The state law actually spells out that a reapportionment plan must be filed with the office of the county clerk no later than the day following the board's July meeting. However, my understanding is there's some discussion going on in Springfield as to whether maybe that deadline and some other deadlines maybe need to be adjusted because, as Ryan mentioned, it's going to be early fall at least before we actually have the granular census data from the 2020 census. So where the board has been so far, this year I've tasked our Governance, Health, and Administration Committee with the process, working through this process to provide a recommendation to the full board. The committee started their discussion in January with a review of some relevant materials, including information off of census.gov, the 2019 census estimates, which we're told that that's a relatively new process for the Census Bureau. So there's some question as to exactly how accurate those numbers may be. Because it's relatively new, there's no historical data to show a trend or anything as far as accuracy. But looking at those numbers as well as the 2010 census numbers, and looking at the breakdown of those numbers by different scenarios, say 15 districts, 17 districts, 19 districts, even one scenario of multi-member districts, and how that would impact the districts as far as the population, the number of households within the districts, and so on. We also, in the first week of March, held 2 virtual town hall meetings. I was actually very surprised and pleased with the turnout at those meetings. We had in excess of 40 people, and I believe 50 people attend each of those meetings. And there was a lot of different questions and stuff like that. So it was a good opportunity for public engagement and for the public to learn about the process and what's involved. In addition to that, we also invited numerous community organizations to have representatives sit down with the members of the Governance, Health, and Administration Committee. That took place on March 29th. And we had several organizations participate in that discussion, asked questions, expressed thoughts and concerns. So I think that was very productive. I got a lot of positive feedback from members of those various organizations. With all of this being said, with the board reduction being part of the process this year, the board obviously needs to determine not only the number of board members, but the structure as far as at large versus county board districts, number per district, and so on. The board needs to make that determination so that once we get the green light from the state as far as how we're supposed to move forward with actually getting the maps drawn with hopefully some accurate census data, we'll be able to get that process started. So it is possible that the committee could actually have a recommendation when it comes to the number of members and the structure and so on to the full board as early as this month or possibly next month, with a map coming at a later date, obviously, once we get some direction, if you will, from the state as far as how we move forward with that.
Thank you. I appreciate you providing the information for us tonight.
I hope that provided a somewhat well-rounded picture of where we've been and where we're trying to get to. And the important thing that I would like to emphasize is that we're just trying to make sure that this is done in a way that is best for all the residents of the county.
Is there a listserv or somewhere that people can sign up? Like, I really appreciate that you did all these public hearings and worked with these groups. I hadn't really heard about any of those. So I'm wondering where we would sign up to get information to be able to participate in anything else that's coming up, or is the public process closed already?
Well, it is. The only thing that we had considered was possibly when we get to the actual mapping portion of it. Obviously, we want to make sure that is well vetted by the public. But the virtual town halls were actually those were actually promoted through local media as well as social media and over a dozen community organizations.
Oh, no, I appreciate that. Is there a way to sign up to future, so we know we're getting future ones? Because I apparently wasn't on any of those lists.
Okay. We don't actually have any type of a link or anything to sign up for anything like that. If anyone was interested, they can email me at the county, and I can make sure that they get that information.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I mean, I think I'll just want to share it, or maybe I can send you the League of Women Voters email.
Sure.
And then we can share it with our people, I think would make sense.
Sure, that would work.
You mentioned that you're still trying to decide between districts and at large, but then you mentioned you're still thinking about a map. Does that mean that decision has mostly been made, or?
The committee has not established a formal recommendation for the board. At this point, there's still just discussions being had. Nothing has actually been formalized. So, I mean, it would be premature for me to say that, yes, the committee has decided this as a recommendation on any of the items, just because that hasn't been formalized. At this point, it has been discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, and what I'm saying as far as between say districts or at large, those are simply options that are laid out in state statute.
Okay.
Those are things that the board has to determine as part of the reapportionment process.
Okay.
And that is the perfect segue into our question answer portion of tonight's event. So I will leave the floor open for additional questions to ask of either Ryan or Richard. And I would just also like to provide a shout out to Porter McNeil for bringing all of these pieces together for tonight's event. So thank you very much, Porter.
You're welcome.
Questions?
Well, that's a perfect segue. I'll, if I could ask a question, a couple quick ones. To Ryan, what are you hearing? What are the tea leaves saying, the great political grapevine on the rumor that the primary of March 2022 would have to be moved back to accommodate for all the delays here in census? That would require a special bill passed by the General Assembly, right?
Yeah, so what in Illinois, it's still been unclear from lawmakers. I think for state remapping, it's been made clear that they plan to get a map done by June 30th. Now, there's a few options that have been recommended by some national organizations, like doing a two-step process, which would be pass a map and then come back and redo it. There's also been other states that have said, realize this issue earlier, like California, where the state General Assembly went to the state Supreme Court and said, we're not going to meet these constitutional deadlines. Will you provide relief given the circumstances of the pandemic and the bureau delays, which we had no control over? California's state Supreme Court allowed for that delay, and then lawmakers passed a law to push back their primary election for primaries in non-presidential years. In Illinois, we have not been told that either of those options, whether the two-step process for state maps or that they would seek relief from the courts, is going to happen. If the General Assembly is to move forward with the June 30th map, that would almost guarantee that US 2020 census data would not be the data they're using to draw the map. And so that it's kind of left to speculation that they would use American Community Survey sampling data from 2015 to 2019, but none of the lawmakers on the redistricting committees in the House or the Senate have confirmed that's their actual intention. That's just been a lot of speculation, and then a lot of back and forth in committees about the merits of ACS data versus US Census Bureau data. And so that's one of the things, a part of our advocacy is, if we want the public to engage in this in a meaningful way, then the information needs to be clear on just how what this process looks like from mid-April until June 30th, or until September, when the US Census Bureau is going to get us the data we need for the granular level redistricting, and when we get into where these lines are actually going to fall, because one of the things too, we don't want to use data that may inadvertently disenfranchise communities because it's not specific enough, at least from our perspective as an advocacy organization. And so we're kind of in a wait and see, unfortunately. I wish I had a better answer for that, but that's something that the General Assembly just isn't making clear at this point.
Quick follow-up, and then on the district only or the at-large, that Richard Brunk, thanks for joining us. I know you're busy. I remember in Springfield, there was a federal lawsuit against the city form of government in Springfield. This is in the late 80s. And it was because they, at that time, had a form of government, city government, that elected them at large. And the minority population in Springfield challenged that with a federal voting rights lawsuit. So do you know, like in general, talking at the county level or any level, district or at large, what are the pros and cons that, Ryan, that you would see based on your research on that?
So, was that question to me, Porter?
Yeah.
I haven't done a whole lot comparing districts at large to single member districts. I think it's difficult, and I don't want to speculate like one size fits all for each county or each local government. But I know, like, for Chicago, we've been involved in the remap, and I know that's something that's been suggested here as well, is that you have at large or multi-member districts is another thing. I just don't know if you can take a one size fits all approach to say every county should do it this way or every municipality should do it this way.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it. Any other follow-up questions or completely separate questions that people might have?
I just want to say thank you to everybody. This has been very helpful.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely. So thanks to everyone that provided their time, their expertise tonight. Very much appreciated. Our goal, of course, as the league is to provide community education toward whatever we can do as far as voting and getting people on board with help and changes in the government. So we will post this recording on Facebook, and we'll look for any follow-up questions that people might have and triage accordingly. And if you think of any other insights that you wanted to provide as well, feel free to let us know. And Anissa is our guru to provide all of those pieces. So we'll make sure we get that out there. So thanks so much for providing your time and expertise. And we look forward to connecting again.
All right. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank
Lisa.
you, everyone.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Richard, I absolutely sorry. I was like, I wasn't